Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Please subscribe my channel. The crack echoed across the 12th floor boardroom, sharp against the hum of recessed fluorescent lighting and the low whir of the ceiling vents. And for one suspended second all I could see was my own reflection in the smoked glass wall behind him. The walnut conference table gleamed under the white light. Half-drunk espressos sat in white porcelain cups on black leather coasters. My presentation remote was still warm in my palm. Richard stood at the head of the table in a navy suit that looked custom-cut to intimidate people, one hand planted beside my closed laptop, the other holding a stapled packet of emails like a prosecutor holding an indictment. To his right, Sandra Pike, our CFO, straightened the neat stack of printed pages in front of her without looking at me. Vanessa Cole, our chief people officer, crossed one silk-covered leg over the other and tilted her head with a little smile that never reached her eyes. And my husband, Daniel Mercer, my supposed partner of 9 years, my supposed ally in every room that mattered, leaned back in his chair and studied his cuff links as if my public execution had already become boring. "Would you like to explain this?" Richard said, lifting the packet, "before we involve the board formally." I could smell the citrus polish on the table. I could hear somebody shifting in one of the leather chairs near the wall. At the far end of the room, two division presidents kept their eyes lowered, the way people do when they've decided in advance they're not the one being sacrificed. Daniel finally looked up, resting both forearms on the table with deliberate calm, and when he spoke his voice was so controlled it felt colder than a shout. "Claire," he said, "tell them why acquisition materials were forwarded from your account to a private address last Tuesday. My name is Claire Holloway. I'm 37. And this is the story of how I let an entire executive team walk out on me in the middle of my own presentation so I could expose the fraud they'd built, the marriage they'd faked, and the dynasty they thought would survive me." No one said anything for a moment after that first accusation. The silence pressed down on the room until it had weight. Then Richard slid the printed emails across the table toward me. The paper stopped against the edge of my notebook. "Read the header," he said. I didn't touch it yet. I just looked at him. Richard had a way of widening his stance when he wanted to make the room feel smaller. He did it in earnings calls, in negotiations, at family Christmas dinners in Winnetka when he wanted people to remember whose house they were standing in. His silver watch flashed under the lights as he tapped the packet once with his index finger. Sandra cleared her throat and spoke without lifting her chin. The messages contained confidential material tied to the Hawthorne acquisition. Preliminary valuation, headcount consolidation scenarios, legal exposure estimates. This leak, if verified, would constitute gross misconduct. Vanessa let out a soft breath through her nose, the closest thing she ever got to laughter in formal settings. "Not to mention a catastrophic breach of trust," she added. I looked at Daniel. He didn't return it right away. He was wearing the charcoal tie I bought him in Milan 2 years earlier, when I still believed thoughtful details mattered more than patterns. He folded his hands and finally met my eyes with that maddening expression he used whenever he wanted to appear burdened rather than guilty. "We gave you a chance to explain privately," he said. "You insisted on presenting today anyway." That lie was elegant. Casual. Delivered like a paperweight set quietly on top of a stack of forged documents. "I insisted," I said evenly, "because you told me the integration deck had been moved to this morning." Richard's mouth hardened. "Don't split hairs. I'm not." One of the division presidents, Marco Ellis from Southwest Distribution, shifted in his chair and glanced at Sandra. She gave the smallest possible nod, and that was apparently enough permission for him to join in. "This has already rattled the senior ops team," he said. "We're getting calls." Another voice followed. Priya Deshmukh, who ran enterprise sales and had spent the last 4 years borrowing my analysts and taking credit for my risk models, leaned forward with both palms flat on the table. "If the board thinks we can't control internal confidentiality," she said, "the debt package for Q3 expansion is dead." There was the pile-on. Timed. Layered. Everyone taking their turn to make my alleged betrayal feel expensive enough to justify whatever came next. Vanessa uncapped a Mont Blanc pen and set it beside a cream-colored folder. "HR has prepared separation documents," she said almost gently. "If you resign today we can classify this as a voluntary leadership transition. That would be better for everyone." "For everyone," I repeated. Richard pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down at last, the leather giving a quiet sigh beneath him. Don't make this uglier than it needs to be, Claire. That sentence told me everything. Folder. The timing. The witnesses. They hadn't discovered anything. They had built a theater set and invited an audience. I opened the packet and scanned the first page. My name. My company email. A private Proton mail address on the receiving line. Time stamp. 11:14 p.m. last Tuesday. Subject line. Hawthorne revised synergy assumptions. At a glance it was convincing. At a legal standard it was garbage. Daniel must have mistaken my stillness for panic because he leaned in, softened his voice and tried on concern. If there's something else going on, he said, now is the time to say it. I turned my head toward him. Is it? His jaw flexed once. Richard took that as his cue to end the scene. We're done here. He stood, collected his phone and looked around the table. Executive session in Conference B. Claire can meet with Vanessa and sign. Chairs scraped back all at once. That was the moment the title of this story was born. Not when Richard accused me. Not when Daniel lied. When the entire executive team stood and walked out during my presentation as if my voice, my work and my existence in that room had already been erased. Sandra rose first, tucking a strand of blunt-cut hair behind one ear and gathering her legal pad to her chest. Priya avoided my eyes completely. Marco gave me the uncomfortable half-nod people reserve for funerals and layoffs. Vanessa picked up the separation folder in manicured fingers and held it against her silk blouse like a hostess bringing dessert into a dining room. Daniel was the last to stand. He placed both hands on the table, leaned toward me and lowered his voice so only I could hear. Don't force this into something it isn't, he said. I looked down at the cream folder in Vanessa's hand, then back at him. That depends, I said calmly. What exactly do you think it is? Something passed over his face then. Not fear. Not yet. Just a flicker. The smallest hairline crack in the mask. Richard was already at the door. Daniel. Daniel straightened and walked away. Vanessa lingered half a second longer than the others. Her perfume drifted past me first, expensive and powdery, before she offered the folder with a sympathetic tilt of her head. I can stay if you need support, she said. I let my eyes drop briefly to the gold bracelet at her wrist. I had seen that bracelet before, glinting on the passenger seat of Daniel's car 3 weeks earlier. He told me it belonged to his sister. He didn't have a sister. No, I said. You should probably go with them. Her fingers tightened around the folder. Claire. And leave my laptop open. That stopped her. For the first time that morning she looked unsure. Just for a beat. Then she placed the folder on the table, turned and followed the others out. The door shut softly behind her. Their footsteps receded down the corridor like a metronome counting down to someone else's mistake. I sat alone in the fluorescent quiet and listened until the building swallowed every trace of them. Then I opened my laptop. The presentation deck was still on screen beneath the closed system prompt. Blue title slide. Q3 integration strategy. Mercer Vale Logistics. My name at the bottom. I touched the trackpad once, woke the display fully and plugged in the encrypted flash drive from the inside pocket of my blazer. I didn't rush. That was the important part. People who believe they've trapped you expect tears, bargaining, rage, maybe one desperate attempt to explain. They expect movement. Visible damage. I took a sip of cold coffee from the porcelain cup at my right. I opened the audit folder on the drive. I pulled up the message headers Richard had just theatrically thrown in front of me. Then I opened the second file, the one Daniel never knew existed because he had never once asked why I insisted our strategy team use watermarking on draft decks. Every unauthorized export of the Hawthorne materials had been tagged. Every forwarded attachment carried a hidden forensic marker. Every login attempt against my account for the last 90 days had been mirrored to an external archive under a governance rule Richard himself signed 7 years earlier and forgot the second it became inconvenient. I picked up my phone, opened my contacts and called one person. She answered on the second ring. Helena Voss. Her voice was crisp, low and entirely awake despite the hour. Helena chaired Mercer Vale's audit committee and served as our lead independent director. Before that, she spent 12 years in SEC enforcement and another decade dismantling companies that thought family ownership was the same thing as immunity. Richard had always treated her like a decorative concession to governance. He liked to call her formidable when she was in the room and impossible when she wasn't. Helena, I said. It's Claire Holloway. They just triggered the reporting clause. There was no pause. Not even a breath. Are you safe to speak? Yes. Are you alone? Yes. Good, she said. Do not sign anything. Do not leave the building. Send me what you have in the next 3 minutes. I glanced toward the shut boardroom door, toward the corridor where my husband and his father and the rest of that polished little firing squad were probably congratulating themselves over catered pastries. I already prepared the packet, I said. That got the faintest reaction out of her. Not surprise. Approval. I thought you might have, Helena said. Send it now. And Claire. Yes. If this is what I think it is, when I walk into that building no one leaves until I say they do. I sent the files. Then I sat back in my chair, folded my hands and waited. The next 7 minutes were the longest of my life and the calmest. I watched the little sending bar complete on my screen. I heard phones buzz faintly through the wall in the conference room next door. At one point someone laughed. Marco, I think. A short nervous bark. Then silence again. I used that time to do something petty and practical at once. I took the cream-colored separation folder Vanessa had left behind and opened it carefully. Voluntary resignation. Non-disparagement. Release of claims. Immediate forfeiture of deferred compensation. A line item buried on page 4 assigning responsibility for unauthorized disclosure losses to me pending internal review. Neat. Efficient. Weaponized. I photographed every page. Then I turned to the last slide in my deck and added one sentence beneath the revenue bridge chart in 12-point font. Governance failures are never sudden. They are rehearsed. At minute 8 my phone rang. Security has been instructed not to let anyone exit the executive floor, Helena said. I'm 22 minutes away. Outside counsel is joining by video until I arrive. Do not engage them without me. I wasn't planning to. Good. Send me the separation documents too. I already did. A brief silence. Then, Claire. Yes. I know this is personal. I looked at the walnut grain of the table, at the small circular ring left by someone's coffee cup near the head chair Richard used as a throne. Yes, I said. Try very hard, Helena replied, to keep it professional until I make it expensive. When she ended the call I smiled for the first time that day. 5 minutes later the boardroom door opened so abruptly it hit the stopper in the wall. Daniel came in first. His controlled expression was gone. Not destroyed exactly. Just loosened. Sandra was behind him, clutching her phone so tightly the tendons stood out in her wrist. Vanessa lingered at the threshold. Richard entered last, jaw set, eyes bright with the temper he saved for situations he didn't control. What did you do? He asked. I didn't answer immediately. I closed my laptop with slow precision then opened it again. A tiny act of theater. The kind he would understand. I made a phone call. Richard stepped closer. To whom? You know to whom. Sandra set her phone face down on the table as if contact with it had become painful. Helena has frozen floor access, she said. She contacted building security and outside counsel. She said there's a governance issue under charter review. Richard turned to her sharply. Based on what? I opened the email header file and rotated the screen toward them. Based on the fact that the message you printed for your little stage play was routed through a device in Daniel's office using a shadow credential created from Vanessa's admin authorization and approved through Sandra's finance override. No one moved. Then Daniel laughed once, short and humorless. That's ridiculous. Is it? Vanessa recovered first. She folded her arms, nails pressing into silk. Admin authorizations touch half this building. That proves nothing. Agreed, I said. By itself. I clicked to the next file. A log export. Time stamps. Device IDs. Access paths. This is the login mirror from my account, I said. It records every attempt against strategy archives for the past 90 days. There are 12 unauthorized entries. 10 originated from Daniel's office. 2 came from the executive guest suite on the 16th floor. Richard looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Sandra. Sandra's face had gone visibly pale under the fluorescent light. Those logs shouldn't exist, she said before she could stop herself. That was revelation number 1 and it landed exactly where I wanted it. I let the implication settle over the room, then took another sip of my now cold coffee. They do, I said. Because when Richard pushed through the Hawthorne acquisition despite valuation anomalies, I invoked enhanced document tracking on all draft materials. Richard's voice sharpened. You did that without authorization. No, I said quietly. I did it under Section 4.8 of the Governance Manual. The same section you triggered when you accused an officer of a material leak in front of witnesses. Daniel took a step toward me. Claire, whatever you think this is. I know what it is. I opened the second folder. Screen captures. Hotel invoices. Car service receipts. Calendar exports. Vanessa saw the first one and the blood left her face so quickly it was like a blind being pulled up from a window. Claire, Daniel said, but his voice cracked on my name. That was revelation number 2. Should I explain? I asked evenly. Why Mercer Vale paid for multiple private bookings at the Halstead House under code entries labeled vendor entertainment when the guests were you and Vanessa. Vanessa stared at Daniel as if he had personally failed to keep gravity intact. You told me those were personal cards. Sandra pulled out a chair and sat down too fast, the leather bumping hard against the table edge. Richard didn't sit. He just planted both hands on the walnut surface and glared at the documents as though anger might redact them. This is irrelevant, he snapped. No, I said. It's motive. Then I opened the audio file. I had not intended to use it that early. But sometimes when a structure starts to collapse, the fastest way to finish is to pull the right beam. The recording came from the old executive dining room, a narrow glass-walled space off Richard's office where he liked to hold informal meetings because he incorrectly assumed rooms without formal booking systems were invisible. They weren't. Not after our security retrofit in January. The voices were slightly tinny but perfectly clear. Sandra first. If she presents the integration numbers, the timing won't hold. Richard next, flat and impatient. Then she doesn't present. Daniel after that, quiet enough that I had leaned closer the first time I heard it. She'll ask questions if we try to move it. Vanessa, brisk and efficient. Then we give her something else to defend. The room around me didn't simply go silent. It folded in on itself. That was revelation number 3. Richard straightened so abruptly his chair rolled backward. Turn that off. I did not. My own husband's voice filled the boardroom again from my laptop speakers. If it gets ugly, I'll handle her. Vanessa whispered, oh my God. The recording continued. Paper shuffling. A glass set down. Richard saying, once the board thinks she leaked Hawthorne, we classify the rest as contamination. Clean the file. Control the narrative. I clicked pause. Daniel's lips had parted slightly but no words came out. Sandra stared at the table as if it might open and swallow her. Vanessa looked from him to Richard to me, and for the first time since I'd known her, she appeared not polished but ordinary. Frightened. Human. Angry in a way she had not prepared cosmetically. Richard recovered first because people like Richard always do. You were recording internal conversations. Actually, I said, you were committing fraud. The sentence landed with a strange softness because I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth does its best work when it arrives without effort. Daniel pulled out the chair beside me and sat, rubbing a hand over his mouth. Claire, listen to me. Those discussions were taken out of context. Were they? Yes. He leaned forward, palms open now, abandoning the cold certainty from half an hour earlier. Hawthorne was unstable. We were trying to control fallout. The leak issue was meant to buy time. By blaming me. Temporarily. I turned to Vanessa. And the affair. Was that also temporary? She flinched as if I'd touched her. Richard slapped the table once. Personal matters are beside the point. They became the point, I said, when you used them to compromise internal reporting and manipulate executive decisions. Sandra finally found her voice. You can't prove financial misconduct from one conversation and some invoices. I clicked again. Spreadsheet. Vendor ledgers. Reclassification tabs highlighted in amber. I can prove it from the rebooking entries, I said. I can prove it from the pulled forward revenue on the North Point contract, from the deferred integration costs hidden in Q2, and from the side letter Daniel signed on April 17 without disclosure. Sandra's hand flew to her mouth. Richard turned on her so fast his chair legs screeched. What side letter? That was not for me. That was real. Sandra looked at Daniel. Daniel didn't answer. The first crack between them widened. I watched it happen in real time, that perfect family business illusion finally failing under its own weight. Richard had assumed Daniel was loyal. Daniel had assumed Sandra was compliant. Sandra had assumed Vanessa knew less than she did. Vanessa had assumed Daniel would protect her. And all of them had assumed I was still the woman who spent 10 years smoothing rough edges, translating tempers into strategy, protecting reputations because I believed stability had value of its own. I closed the spreadsheet and stood. Their eyes followed me, all four of them. Not because I moved fast. Because I moved slowly. I'm going to say this once, I said. You accused me in front of witnesses using falsified evidence. You prepared resignation papers assigning me liability for losses tied to conduct you orchestrated. You accessed restricted files, misused company funds, concealed related party activity, and attempted to interfere with the reporting process after triggering an independent review clause. Helena Voss is on her way. Outside counsel is already involved. If you want to keep speaking before she arrives, understand that I will remember every word. No one said anything. Then Vanessa pushed back from the table so quickly the legs caught against the carpet. Daniel told me there was no financial issue, she said, the words coming faster now. He said this was about positioning Claire out before the board retreat. Richard turned on Daniel. You told her. Daniel stood too. Don't do that. Not now. Sandra looked sick. What side letter, Daniel? He didn't answer her. He looked at me instead. Did you know, he asked quietly, about Vanessa? I met his eyes. 3 months ago. His shoulders dropped by an inch. Just an inch. That was the moment he understood this hadn't started this morning. Whatever story he had told himself about being ahead of me, managing me, anticipating my reactions, it ended there. Richard stepped away from the table and adjusted his cuffs with jerky fingers. We're done speaking until counsel is present. A good instinct, I said. He pointed at me. Do not mistake process for victory. I held his gaze. Do not mistake noise for power. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Richard turned and walked out. Sandra followed, one hand still at her throat. Vanessa moved after them but stopped beside Daniel, waiting to see whether he would go with her. He didn't. He stayed where he was, staring at me in the hard white light. You set this up, he said. I picked up the separation folder and slid it toward him. No, I replied. You did. Then I walked out of the boardroom, heels striking the stone corridor with clean, even rhythm, and left him sitting alone with the papers he'd planned for me. They thought they had a scapegoat. They had no idea they had just delivered themselves into the one arena where I was strongest. The one built on records, patience, and people who still believed facts mattered. The next 3 days passed in layers of polished wood, legal pads, camera lenses, and controlled voices. Mercer Vale retained outside counsel through a special committee Helena formed that same afternoon. By 6 o'clock, all executive data access had been suspended except mine and the forensic teams. By 9, Daniel had moved into the guest house on the family's Lake Forest property because Richard insisted the optics required separation. By midnight, I had forwarded every personal message between Daniel and Vanessa that touched company travel, expense usage, or strategy scheduling to the review archive, then set my phone face down on my kitchen island and watched the city lights from my condo windows until dawn. 48 hours later, the formal confrontation took place at Sutter, Bain and Rowe in a boardroom that looked designed by people who thought credibility should have a scent. The air held leather and coffee and the faint mineral smell of chilled bottled water. A wall of dark shelving framed rows of red-spined legal volumes no one touched anymore. The conference table was gleaming mahogany, long enough to make distance feel official. Outside the windows, downtown Chicago was washed in pale autumn sunlight, all glass and steel and measured ambition. I arrived first with Helena. She wore a charcoal suit, low heels, and the expression of a woman who had once ruined better men than Richard Mercer before lunch. Her silver hair was pinned neatly back. She carried no theatrics with her, only a slim black folder and an iPad full of things that could end careers. Beside her sat Julian Cross, lead counsel from Sutter, Bain and Rowe, meticulous in navy wool, with a voice so even it seemed to lower the temperature around him. On the screen at the far end of the room, a forensic accountant named Meredith Shaw waited remotely from New York, her spreadsheets already queued. Helena glanced at me as she took her seat. "How are you?" I set my notebook on the table and smoothed the edge of a page with my thumb. "Clear. That's enough." When the others arrived, I saw immediately how much had changed since the ambush. Richard still wore expensive suits, but authority sits differently on a man after he's been denied the ability to leave a room. He entered first, shoulders square, yet his chin was lifted a fraction too high, as if posture alone could replace certainty. Daniel came behind him, gray at the edges despite shaving too carefully that morning. Sandra clutched a legal pad against her chest and kept scanning the room like exits might spontaneously appear. No one sat where they had sat 3 days earlier at Mercer Vale. That mattered more than people think. Richard did not take the head of the table. Daniel did not sit beside me. Vanessa chose a seat with a full chair between her and Sandra. Tiny fractures become architecture very quickly in formal rooms. Julian folded his hands and began. "This meeting is being held pursuant to the authority delegated by the Special Committee of the Board on October 14th, he said. Its purpose is to review preliminary findings regarding allegations of evidence fabrication, misuse of company resources, concealment of material information and retaliation against an officer who engaged protected reporting procedures." There was no rise in his tone when he said protected. No added weight. That's why it worked. He wasn't performing outrage. He was inventorying exposure. Richard's attorney, a sharp-featured man named Paul Gerston, adjusted his glasses. "My client disputes every characterization embedded in that summary." Julian nodded. "You may do so after presentation of the evidence." He tapped the table lightly and Meredith Shaw's screen expanded on the monitor. What followed was the most satisfying hour of my professional life, not because anyone shouted but because everything was so methodical. No dramatics. No speeches. Just proof stacked in the right order until resistance became mathematically embarrassing. First came the email fabrication analysis. Meredith displayed message header paths, authentication anomalies, and the credential chain tying the supposed leak from my account to a temporary admin token generated under Vanessa's HR console and used from Daniel's office device at 11:14 p.m. last Tuesday. Then she showed that the private address receiving the files had been created from a company guest network using a prepaid mobile hotspot later expensed through Sandra's discretionary budget under Competitive Intelligence Services. Sandra's attorney leaned toward her. Sandra didn't look back. She was staring at the screen with her lips parted slightly, as if the evidence had become a language she no longer understood. Julian moved to the next item. "Second, we have the preparation of resignation materials prior to any internal fact-finding." He slid copies of Vanessa's folder across the table. Dated the night before the ambush. Draft versions with track changes. Comments in the margin from an internal HR manager asking whether deferred compensation forfeiture language was too aggressive, and Vanessa replying, "Keep it. She won't negotiate if she feels cornered." Vanessa's counsel set a hand on her arm. She pulled away. Julian continued. "Third, retaliatory intent." The audio recording played. No one interrupted this time. They just listened to their own voices in that small glass dining room, hearing what I had heard. Hearing the confidence. The coordination. The assumption that control and secrecy were synonyms. When Daniel's voice came through the speakers, "If it gets ugly, I'll handle her," he shut his eyes once and lowered his head. Richard's attorney finally cut in. "We object to the use of surreptitious internal recordings." Helena answered before Julian could. "You may preserve that objection for any forum where it still matters." Then came the timeline. Julian stood and walked to the wall display, where Meredith had built a visual chronology out of dates, authorizations, travel records, and contract modifications. It began 6 months earlier on April 17th, with the side letter Sandra had not known about. A private amendment to the North Point freight contract signed by Daniel, guaranteeing service credits that materially changed revenue recognition assumptions. The letter had not been disclosed to finance properly because if it had been, Q2 numbers would have missed internal targets. 2 weeks later, Sandra's team reclassified integration expenses. 3 weeks after that, Richard pressured strategy to accelerate Hawthorne valuation despite unresolved diligence gaps. In July, Vanessa approved expanded admin rights for executive scheduling continuity. In August, company funds began covering Daniel and Vanessa's hotel meetings through coded vendor entries. In September, my account saw its first unauthorized access attempt. In early October, the false leak package was assembled. On the 14th, they staged the walkout. Julian's finger moved down the timeline one date at a time. April 17th. Side letter executed. May 2nd. Revenue impact concealed. July 12th. Unauthorized access permissions expanded. August 6th. Personal expenditures routed through company budgets. September 23rd. Draft leak narrative circulated internally. October 14th. Formal retaliation event. Premeditation does not sound dramatic when presented correctly. It sounds administrative. That is far more devastating. Richard broke first. This company was built on judgment calls, he said sharply. Every leadership team in America manages timing, forecasting, narrative. Julian cut him off with almost surgical politeness. Narrative is not a recognized accounting principle, Mr. Mercer. Even Helena allowed herself a small glance downward then, the nearest thing she came to amusement. Daniel's attorney leaned toward him. We need to revisit our earlier conversation, he whispered. Sandra found her voice next, brittle and thin. I didn't know about the side letter. Daniel told me North Point terms were unchanged. Daniel turned to her. You signed the revenue memo. Because finance was given partial exhibits. Don't pin that entirely on me. Richard swiveled toward him. Entirely on you. That letter is your signature. Vanessa laughed once, a stunned little sound with no humor in it. This is unbelievable. I looked at her. Is it? She met my eyes for the first time since entering the room, and something passed between us then. Not forgiveness. Not solidarity. Recognition maybe. The recognition that the man who lied to me had lied to her too, just with different promises and softer lighting. Julian let the room destabilize for a few seconds before he introduced the next witness. Before we move to proposed resolutions, he said, there is one additional source whose materials the special committee believes are directly relevant to intent and coordination. The door opened. Nora Kim stepped into the boardroom carrying a slim binder and a stainless steel water bottle. She wore a simple black dress, low heels, and the expression of someone who had spent the last week deciding fear was less important than self-respect. For 4 years, Nora had been Daniel's executive assistant. She managed his calendar, filtered his calls, handled his travel, and knew where every soft body was buried because she was the one usually told to reserve the room. Daniel went still. Completely still. Nora, he said as if the name itself were a malfunction. Nora took the empty chair near Julian and set down the binder. Good morning. Richard looked at her like he was trying to place a piece on a board he'd never considered important enough to notice. Vanessa's fingers tightened around her pen. Julian nodded to Nora. Please explain your role. She did. Calmly. Curry. No embellishment. She explained that Daniel had instructed her repeatedly to schedule off-site vendor meetings that were not vendor meetings. She explained that she had been asked to send calendar invites to my team with altered time blocks to keep me away from certain executive discussions. She explained that in late September, Vanessa asked her to print a draft resignation template for contingency planning, and when Nora hesitated, Richard himself told her to stop acting like policy exists to make operations harder. She explained that Daniel later instructed her to create a guest network forwarding route for the false email package because it only needed to look real long enough to clean house. The words sat in the room like polished stones. Heavy. Undeniable. Daniel leaned forward, voice suddenly hoarse. Nora, that is not what I said. Nora opened her binder and slid out a page. Then I'm sure you'll want to explain why you texted me on October 12th. Make sure Claire sees only the leak set. Dad wants one path, no confusion. Daniel did not answer. Julian asked the question everyone in the room was silently holding. Miss Kim, why did you choose to preserve these materials? Nora looked at him, then at me. Because Miss Holloway taught me to preserve everything when instructions stop making sense, she said. And because when I told Mr. Mercer I wasn't comfortable backdating access notes, he suggested I remember who sponsored my promotion. Ms. Holloway was the only senior executive who ever told me I should never confuse dependence with loyalty. Daniel stared at me then. Not Nora. Me. That was the long game laid bare. Months earlier, after a late board dinner, I found Nora in the elevator trying not to cry because Daniel had blamed her for a scheduling error that was actually his. I took her for coffee in the lobby cafe downstairs, a narrow marble place with terrible pastries and excellent tea, and I told her something I wish someone had told me at 25. Never put your career in the hands of a charming man who benefits from your silence. Apparently she remembered. Richard was furious now, but the fury had lost its center. This is absurd. We're letting assistants reinterpret executive conversations. Helena leaned back in her chair, folded one leg over the other, and regarded him as if he had become tedious. No, Richard. We're allowing corroborated evidence to reveal executive conversations. Then the fracturing really started. Sandra demanded to know why Daniel hid North Point. Daniel snapped that finance had every chance to ask harder questions. Vanessa said she had been assured the HR documents were defensive only, not part of a staged accusation. Richard told her she should have known enough to stay in her lane. Vanessa actually laughed again, but this time there was steel in it. Why lane? That's rich coming from the man who used me as camouflage. Daniel's attorney asked for a break. Richard's attorney asked for privilege. Sandra whispered that she wanted separate exposure analysis. Vanessa told her own counsel loud enough for everyone to hear, if there's criminal referral risk, I'm not protecting anyone. No one was a team anymore. That was the strange beauty of truth in a closed room. It doesn't just reveal what happened. It reveals the exact price of every false alliance. When the room finally quieted, Julian laid out the options with the same tone he had used to describe document logs. The special committee's current position is as follows. 1. Immediate administrative leave has already been imposed. 2. Absent prompt resolution, the committee is prepared to notify the company's lenders, external auditors, and appropriate regulators of evidence indicating retaliation, accounting irregularities, falsification of internal materials, and misuse of corporate funds. 3. The committee will authorize civil action to recover improperly expensed amounts and losses associated with reputational damage. 4. Individual cooperation will be considered separately. Richard's face had reddened. You're threatening to destroy this company. Helena answered him quietly. No. We're preventing you from doing it privately. Julian slid 4 document sets onto the table. Resignation agreements. Repayment schedules. Non-interference covenants. Acknowledgement of forensic review and preservation duties. The paper made a clean whispering sound against the mahogany as each set found its owner. This is the committee's proposed path, Julian said. Cooperate now, and the company may contain this as a governance failure with managed disclosures. Refuse, and we proceed in a far less private direction. No one reached for a pen immediately. I looked at Daniel. He looked exhausted in a way I had never seen before, the kind that comes when charm finally stops generating oxygen. There had been a time when I could read him from the angle of his shoulders in a doorway. Now he looked like a stranger who had borrowed someone familiar's face. He swallowed. Claire. I said nothing. He tried again. Was any of it real? The room stilled. That question should have offended me. In another life maybe it would have. But by then I understood something crucial. Guilty people rarely ask whether they hurt you. They ask whether the parts that benefited them were genuine. I held his gaze and answered with the truth. Yes, I said. Until it wasn't. He looked down at the document in front of him. Richard did not look down. This is extortion dressed up as governance. No, I said calmly. This is governance dressed up too late. He turned toward me, eyes bright and hard. You think you've won because you found paperwork. I leaned back in my chair. No. I think I've won because I knew you'd create it. Helena looked at me, giving me the space deliberately. So I said the part one had been saving. I wanted you to see them, I said. I wanted you to find exactly what I wanted you to find. The draft deck. The false path. The opening you thought made me disposable. I needed you confident enough to stage the walkout in public. Daniel's expression changed first. Not into anger. Into understanding. He said it almost under his breath. The presentation. I nodded once. The integration deck you shut down was a decoy version. Watermarked. Seated. Harmless on its face, irresistible to people who thought the real value was what they could weaponize around it. Sandra closed her eyes. Richard stared at me as if he were finally meeting the person he'd underestimated for a decade. Julian slid one additional page across to Daniel's counsel. And before anyone asks, yes. The decoy deck and associated tracking measures were reviewed under counsel guidance after the reporting threshold was met. Vanessa looked from me to Nora. So she knew. Nora met her gaze. Longer than you think. I stood then not because I needed to but because some sentences deserve the change in altitude. Next time, I said, looking at Daniel first and then Richard, make sure the person handling your calendar, your expenses, and your lies isn't also the person I taught to read a contract. No one replied. The signing took another 40 minutes. Sandra was first. Her hand trembled only once, right before the acknowledgement page. She signed, requested cooperation credit, and asked for a direct line to external accounting counsel. Vanessa resisted on reimbursement figures, then folded when Julian produced 3 more hotel charges she didn't know we had. Daniel took the longest. He read every page not because he expected to find mercy hidden in legal language, but because men like him often believe they can still negotiate with reality if they slow it down enough. In the end he signed too. Richard held out until Helena said very quietly, "If you force my hand, the first call I make after this room is to your lenders, and the second is to the journal." He signed on the next page. The sound of those signatures was softer than I expected. Just ink moving over paper. That was all. Empires don't always collapse with noise. Sometimes they collapse with a series of neat initials at the bottom of clauses people once assumed would only ever apply to other families. When it was done, Julian collected the documents. The interim secretary sealed them into separate folders. Counsel began murmuring about logistics, property returns, statement language, next steps. The machinery of consequence had engaged. Richard stood, buttoned his jacket, and looked at me with the spent contempt of a man who had built his identity on being the smartest one in the room. "You were always colder than I gave you credit for," he said. I picked up my notebook. "No," I replied. "Just quieter." Then I left the mahogany table, the leather chairs, the entire polished theater of authority, and let the door close behind me while they stayed seated inside it. 6 months later my mornings looked nothing like that life. I wake now in a loft in the West Loop with tall factory windows and old brick walls that catch sunlight in broad honey-colored bands by 7:30. The floors are pale oak. The kitchen counters are matte stone that feels cool under my fingertips before the espresso machine warms the room with its soft mechanical hiss. On clear mornings, the city unfolds outside in layers of glass and motion, and I stand at the window with a heavy ceramic mug between both hands and let myself enjoy something I once treated like a luxury instead of a baseline: peace. Peace is not dramatic. That is one of the first things nobody tells you. It is a cup warming your palms. It is no longer checking whether another person's mood is about to become your problem. It is sunlight on a clean counter. It is your own name on the lease, your own money paying for the coffee, your own silence meaning rest instead of tension. By then the karmic catalog had practically written itself. Richard Mercer resigned as executive chairman within 2 weeks of the special committee meeting. The official announcement cited health and succession planning. No one with half a functioning frontal lobe believed it. In Chicago business circles, where reputations are traded more delicately than securities, the story spread the way these things always do. In steakhouse corners over golf tee times, through spouses who pretend not to know anything while knowing everything. He was not criminally charged, not then, but he was removed from 3 nonprofit boards, disinvited from a keynote panel at the Midwestern Supply Chain Forum, and quietly excluded from the kind of rooms where legacy men go to reassure each other they still matter. For Richard, social exile was a deeper wound than any fine. Daniel lost more slowly, which suited the shape of his vanity. He resigned as COO the same day the separation agreements became effective. Mercer Vale's board required a restatement of 2 quarters internal management reporting, and while the lenders didn't call the whole package, they did tighten covenants, replace half the operating oversight, and insist on a full governance refresh. Daniel tried to position himself as the misunderstood architect of Mercer Vale's growth who had been sacrificed in a political cleanup. That narrative survived for about 11 days. Then one of the trade journals got hold of the expense reclassification story, followed by the North Point side letter, followed by a line that never fully left him. Former executive accused of retaliatory setup against spouse and officer. After that, no serious operator would touch him. He floated himself for advisory roles. Nothing. Tried angel investing. Too much baggage. Launched a vague strategic transformation consultancy out of a rented office in River North with smoked glass conference rooms and no actual clients. The last I heard, he was doing contract work through a friend of a friend in Dallas, the kind of work with no public title and no room to be admired. Vanessa's reckoning was more private and in some ways more cruel. She kept her professional polish longer than most people would have. He was too disciplined not to. But HR leaders live and die by trust. And once it became known that she had prepared retaliatory resignation documents before any investigation, her entire brand collapsed inward. She lost her severance fight. She lost the keynote she was scheduled to give at a Women in Leadership Summit, which would have been funny if it weren't so insulting to the women who almost had to listen to it. The affair details followed her in whispers she could never fully deny or outrun. She moved to a smaller firm in Minneapolis under a reduced title, then left that too within 4 months. The last message she sent me came at 1:12 a.m. in February. I didn't know he lied to both of us. I archived it without replying. Sandra cooperated early and got the softest landing available, which still wasn't soft. She avoided litigation in exchange for full assistance to the forensic review and repayment tied to bonus compensation impacted by the reclassified numbers. She lost her CFO seat, lost a board prospect in St. Louis, and spent the next year consulting on internal controls for a regional manufacturer in Milwaukee. An ironic assignment, but an honest one. Of all of them, she was the only person I occasionally believed might rebuild herself into someone less compromised than the version I knew. The enablers each received their own proportionate accounting. Marco from Southwest, who had piled on in the ambush because he thought proximity to power would protect him, found out very quickly that new management doesn't reward old cowardice. He was passed over for promotion twice, then left to pursue other opportunities that appeared to involve a smaller company and a longer commute. Priya from sales survived the transition but never regained the internal cachet she once had because Helena remembered exactly who had joined the performance. When people show you they'll help bury someone before asking for facts, sensible leaders tend not to hand them sharper tools. And then there were the messages. In the beginning they came fast. Daniel first, of course. This has gone too far. Call me. We can still handle this privately. You're letting Helena use you. Then anger. You humiliated me. You blindsided my family. Do you have any idea what this has done? Then nostalgia, which I found far more offensive. I miss who we were. I still wake up reaching for you. The house doesn't sound the same. My favorite one arrived on a rainy Sunday in November while I was reorganizing a bookshelf. The family isn't the same without you. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Not because it hurt. Because of how perfectly it exposed his worldview. Even then, after everything, I was still being asked to consider the emotional comfort of the structure that tried to consume me. I archived that one too. Richard left one voicemail, clipped and furious, accusing me of forgetting what built this life. Vanessa sent 2 messages, one defensive, one late-night honest. Sandra sent a short apology through counsel. Even Daniel's mother, Elise Mercer, who had spent years gliding around the family's perimeter in cashmere and strategic denial, sent a note on thick cream stationery through my old condo doorman. I wish I had asked harder questions. That one I kept. Not because it fixed anything. Because it was the first truthful sentence I'd ever received from that family without decoration. As for me, I built something new out of the exact skills they taught me to sharpen. 3 months after the special committee resolution, Helena introduced me to 2 founders dealing with succession warfare inside a privately held manufacturing group. A month after that, a lender in Indianapolis asked whether I would review the governance structure of a portfolio company whose CEO kept treating internal controls like personal insults. By spring, I had officially launched Holloway Advisory, a boutique firm specializing in executive risk governance triage and internal retaliation response for companies whose boards realized too late that culture problems become legal ones when ignored long enough. It turns out there is a market for a woman who can walk into a room full of polished liars, identify the hinge on which their story turns and pull it cleanly open. The office I leased sits in an older building on Wacker with brushed steel fixtures, wide plank floors, and a reception area small enough to feel deliberate rather than aspiring. Nora runs operations now. That was my first hire. I asked if she wanted the role over lunch at Avec, beneath low amber lights and rough wooden beams, while she tore bread into careful pieces and tried not to smile too quickly. "You know this will be real work," I told her. She smiled anyway. "That's why I said yes. We're a small team. Intentional. Precise. We help boards understand what their executives think they've hidden. We help leaders document concerns before charm and hierarchy erase them. We teach younger staff the difference between confidentiality and complicity. Sometimes I sit across from women 10 years younger than I was when I married Daniel and tell them in steadier words than I had back then, that confusion is often the first symptom of manipulation. They always go still when they hear that. Because they know. I'm not alone in this life. That matters too. Helena became something I never expected to find after all of it. Not just an ally but a friend. Not a sentimental one. She does not do sentiment cheaply. But once a month, usually on Thursdays, we meet at a little restaurant on Clark with bentwood chairs, linen napkins and old brass sconces that cast everything in forgiving gold. She orders martinis. I usually order sparkling water first and wine later. We talk about cases, boards, books, the strange theater of power, the even stranger relief of outliving the versions of yourself built around survival. One morning in March, Nora brought me coffee in the office and leaned one shoulder against my doorway. "You won't believe who I just saw," she said. I looked up from a draft risk memo. Given our client base, that sentence could mean anything. "Daniel." She held out the coffee. "At LaSalle Street Station. No driver. Carrying his own garment bag." I took the cup and raised an eyebrow. "He looked right at me," she went on, and then pretended he didn't know me. I laughed then. Real laugh. Warm. Unforced. "That sounds difficult for him." He grinned. "I thought you'd appreciate it." That was the thing about karma updates. They arrived casually. Never with trumpets. Just in passing between work and weather and lunch reservations, as if the universe preferred dry humor to dramatic monologues. Another one came from Helena in April over grilled salmon and impossible olives. "Have you heard," she said, cutting neatly into the fish. "Richard tried to re-enter the nonprofit circuit through a logistics ethics initiative." I nearly choked on my water. Ethics. That was my reaction. And she lifted one shoulder. Someone on the selection committee had an excellent memory. We clinked glasses. I never responded to any of them. Not one text. Not one voicemail. Not one handwritten note except through counsel where required. There is a discipline to silence when it is chosen rather than imposed. It does not come from fear. It comes from understanding that closure is not a conversation prize you award people who would only use it to revise the story. That evening, 6 months after the walkout, I stood on the rooftop terrace of my building with a small group of people who knew the whole truth and did not require me to simplify it for their comfort. The city was all orange glass and darkening blue beyond us. Sunset spilled across the river and caught in the windows of the towers until the whole skyline looked lit from within. There were terracotta planters at the terrace edge, rough under my fingertips when I passed them, and low teak tables with candles shivering in the breeze. Somewhere below, traffic moved in patient ribbons of white and red. Above us, the first lights in apartment windows began to blink on, one by one, like a second city quietly waking inside the first. Nora was there, leaning against the railing with a coupe glass in hand and laughing at something Helena had said. So was Elise Mercer. If you had told me a year earlier that I would one day share a rooftop drink with my former mother-in-law and mean it when I asked whether she wanted more Prosecco, I would have assumed you were either delusional or writing bad fiction. Yet there she was, wrapped in a camel coat against the evening wind, looking smaller than she had in the old Winnetka dining room and more honest than I had ever seen her. Elise and I did not become close through confession. That would have been too convenient. We became close through the slow, awkward practice of speaking plainly after years of ritualized omission. A few weeks after the resolution, she asked to meet me at a quiet cafe in Lincoln Park with marble tables and soft yellow lights reflected in the front windows. I almost said no. Then I went anyway. She sat with both hands around a teacup and told me, without excuses, that she had spent her marriage learning to confuse endurance with grace. She told me she saw more than she admitted. She told me Daniel had been raised to believe charm could substitute for character because too many people had rewarded him for the first and excused the absence of the second. She did not ask me to forgive him. She did not ask me to return. She only said, "You were not wrong about what that family had become, and I was wrong to survive it by pretending not to notice." That honesty built something small and real between us. Now, on the rooftop under the orange glow of evening, she held out her glass toward mine. "To new structures," she said. I smiled and tapped the rim of my glass lightly against hers. "The stable kind." The sound was soft and clean. For a while we just stood there watching the light change. The city at sunset has a way of making even hard years look briefly golden, not because they were but because distance lends edges a little grace. I thought about the woman I had been in that fluorescent boardroom. The woman before that too. The one who mistook competence for safety. The one who thought being indispensable to a system would make the system value her. The one who believed composure meant absorbing whatever was thrown at her as long as she did it elegantly. I don't despise her. That's important. I don't look back at that version of myself with contempt. She was not foolish. Just unfinished. She still believed loyalty was most noble when it was unconditional. She had not yet learned that loyalty without discernment is simply self-abandonment in a more flattering outfit. The woman I am now is not harder in the way Richard accused me of being. Not colder. Just more exact. More willing to let people own the consequences of their choices without rushing in to manage the temperature of the room for them. I speak more simply now. I trust slower. I notice faster. I leave earlier. And I no longer confuse being calm with being passive. There is a difference between peace and numbness. I know that now too. Peace has warmth in it. Peace laughs. Peace hires Nora and builds a firm that pays people fairly. Peace has dinner with Helena and learns from Elise without pretending history did not happen. Peace stands under a sunset with a glass in hand and silently thanks every person who tried to diminish her for the education their arrogance provided. Because that is the part no one expects in a story like this. Eventually, if you do it right, gratitude appears. Not for the betrayal itself. Never that. But for the demolition of illusion. For the merciless clarity. For the day the entire executive team walked out during my presentation and left me alone long enough to become impossible to control. The wind shifted, lifting a strand of Nora's hair across her cheek. She tucked it back and asked whether I wanted another drink. Helena was telling Elise a story about a board chair in St. Louis who thought deleting text messages counted as governance. The city kept glowing. Somewhere below us, a siren rose and faded. Candles flickered in their glass holders like small, disciplined fires. I lifted my glass and looked out over the skyline one more time. There was a time when I thought revenge meant watching the people who hurt you suffer exactly as you suffered. There was a time when I thought justice required witnesses, apologies, dramatic admissions, some perfect balancing of pain. I know better now. The most complete endings are rarely theatrical. They are structural. They are the quiet moment when the people who built their lives on your accommodation discover you have withdrawn it permanently. So yes, sometimes I think of Richard in his tailored suits, shut out of rooms where his name used to open doors. Sometimes I think of Daniel carrying his own bag through a train station, practicing invisibility because charm no longer works on strangers. Sometimes I think of Vanessa learning the hard way that being chosen by a weak man is not the same as being valued. Sometimes I think of Sandra rebuilding from the ground up because numbers eventually demand respect from everyone. And then I go back to my life. To the brick walls lit gold in the morning. To the oak floors under bare feet. To the work that matters. To the people who stayed. To the version of me that did not emerge unscarred but emerged intact. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about making people hurt the way you hurt. It's about becoming someone their betrayal no longer has the power to define. And if I've learned anything worth keeping, it's this. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about getting free.